I want to thank you all for coming every week and for the difference you're making in the community and in our world, in the way in which your heart is changing and your minds by just being part of this week after week. And I also want to thank our sponsors, the public library. They're our partners in this, and we really appreciate them. Yay for public libraries. Let's hear it. I regard our libraries as the keeper of our Constitution. I think they're amazing. Riverwoods is another sponsor. Thank you so much. And thank you, all of you who travel here from Exeter and probably now Durham to come to these programs every week. It's so good to see you here. And that's it on our sponsors. I want to thank you all for coming. I did that. Oh, it's important to mention how this all got underway. Thomas Hooker, who was the director of Health and Human Services, back in the 60s and 70s, I think, in New Hampshire. He wanted to honor his wife in a way. He was actually an African-American, first African-American to hold that position in New Hampshire. And he wanted to honor his wife, Eleanor Williams Hooker. And she had died in 2012. And the best way he felt he could honor her memory and her life's work was to be a sponsor of these Tea Talks. So Thomas Hooker has been a sponsor every year as well. And we appreciate him so much for the interest he's taken in the trail and the work we're doing. And our volunteers, where are you? If you could wave so we can see you all. Thank you. We couldn't do this program without you. And I'll get to our panelists in a minute. I also want to thank Jerry Ann for the brilliant programs she puts together week after week. And I think she left the room. Oh, there she is. Come on back in for the recognition here. Jerry Ann and Valerie Cunningham received this past week the New Hampshire Citizens of the Month Award from Senator Maggie Hassan, and that award is, most importantly, entered into the congressional record. So congratulations, Valerie and Jerry Ann. And it's kind of interesting. I've had this conversation with Jerry Ann about the fear we had surrounding the building we bought and all the anxieties of going so deeply into debt and having a vision and believing in it, and how it was part of a 5-year plan that became part of a 6-month plan. And there we were with an opportunity we couldn't resist. But the amazing thing is that platform is giving the trail such capacity across the state. And now these programs are being in demand. The communities are calling us and saying, bring us Tea Talks. So Jerry Ann's working very hard on making sure that we spread the Tea Talks around to all the regions of New Hampshire. And we have such faithful following here that it's a real endorsement for the difference it makes, and that people will show up on a Sunday afternoon from 2 to 4. And so before we get into the program, we just want to review with you our community dialogue group agreement. If you are curious and you want to ask a question or make a statement, be respectful, be sure to listen, share airtime, focus on the idea, not the person, be present, be crisp and say what is core, be open-minded, honor confidentiality. It's okay to put issues like race and class on the table. And this is my favorite place to end. Take risks, be raggedy, and make some mistakes if you need to. It's okay. This is a safe place to say what's on your mind and even say the wrong thing. And then let it go. So this next week, the topic is Racism Without Racists, Educating Generations Past and Future. And our last Tea Talk of the season, New Voices, Our Beliefs, Our Reality. That last one is going to be held back at the Temple Israel on State Street. So next week we're here, the week after we'll be at Temple Israel. And now for today. We are so pleased to welcome our panelists for the program, Culture and Race in the Public Sphere. Many of our beliefs are passed along to us from our families and communities who transmit the foundational ideas that shape how we see the world, how the arts and humanities shape their contents, and also have profound influence on how we form particular beliefs. Our presenters today are Anthony Poore from New Hampshire Humanities. He is the executive director appointed in 2018. Previously, Anthony worked for the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston in regional and community outreach and was assistant dean of Southern New Hampshire University's School of Community Economic Development. Anthony, could you just wave? And thanks, Anthony, for being part of this panel today. Nathaniel Shidley or Shidley? Shidley. Nathaniel Shidley is former executive director of Bostonian Society and now serves as the first president and CEO of Revolutionary Spaces. This new organization completes the merger of the Bostonian Society with Old South Association of Boston. This creates a dynamic new historical resource. Dennis Britton is an associate professor of English at the University of New Hampshire and is author of Becoming Christian: Race, Reformation, and Early Modern English Romance. And that was published in 2014. He is co-editor of Rethinking Shakespeare, Source Study, and he is also the co-editor of a special issue of journal Spencer Studies on Spencer and Race. And Dennis is also the vice president of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. Dennis. And if you live in the Seacoast and you read the Seacoast newspapers, you know who Dennis Robinson is. He's a popular columnist, lecturer, and public historian, and author of a dozen narrative history books on topics ranging from Jesse James and Lord Baltimore to local historical entities like the Music Hall in Wentworth by the Sea Hotel. And Dennis is right here. I think you may all know him. Thank you. And I will ask the panelists to please come to this microphone when you're speaking so that everyone can see you. At the back of the room, it's really hard to see over the heads in front. So please speak at the lectern. All
right. So first of all, let me say thank you. I want to say thank you, Ann. Thank you to Jerry Ann Boges. And thank you for the Black Heritage Trail for having me today. I really appreciate it. I want to say thank you to my colleagues, two Dennises and a Nat, if you will, for joining me up here today to share some thoughts. I also want to recognize that I'm not up here alone, that I'm standing on the shoulders of those that came before us and their spirits. So I want to acknowledge them who are in this room. But I also want to say thank you to you, because I look at you as being experts in this space as well, because we all participate in the public sphere. So you all have something to add to the conversation. So I want to say thank you for coming out today, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with me. So I think it's important to start there. Again, my name is Anthony Poore. I'm the executive director for New Hampshire Humanities. We'll get to them in a minute. What I'd like to do for a moment today is just frame my conversation. My conversation is framed in what I do on an everyday basis, which I hopefully is creating safe places for complicated, complex, and sometimes difficult conversations. But also 25 years of experience working in community development, particularly at the intersections of race, and equity and sustainable communities. So I'll try to bring that lens to this conversation. In the work that I do, I work for New Hampshire Humanities, which I believe is one of the best institutions on the planet. And you all should be proud of the work that we do. And I'm also making an assumption that some of you may not be familiar with the classic definition of what the humanities are, but I want to urge you to pay specific attention to the items that are in bold. The study and the application of the humanities to the human environment with particular attention to reflecting our diverse heritage, traditions, and the history, and to the relevance of the humanities to the current conditions of national life. I think that's really important. I think it frames what we do every single day. And as I think about the world that we live in today and that we inhabit, I don't think there's a more important time than today to think about the role of the humanities in everyday society. But the reality is it started a long time ago. This work and actually the study of the humanities began in the 12th century, classically with grammar and logic and rhetoric, arithmetic or math, geometry, music, and astronomy. And today it basically resides in today's classic liberal arts traditions. Those are languages and arts, literature, philosophy, math, science, religion, and history. All these things that we can learn from, that folks like Dr. Tricia Pion, who's one of our resident historians at New Hampshire Humanities over there, hey Tricia, speaks to every single day. I want to acknowledge my peers here on the thing who actually have a lot to add if so choose. For those that don't know, In 1965, Lyndon Johnson created the National Endowment for the Humanities and also created the National Endowment for the Arts. And the idea, which I think is particularly, right, I said, even today. And I pulled out from the original piece of legislation some of the articles that I thought really focused on today, which is the first article. The arts and the humanities belong to all people of the United States, not just some of us, those that have deep pockets and maybe those that don't. Article 3 I thought was particularly interesting too. An advanced civilization must not limit its efforts to science and technology alone. Think about the focus on science, technology, engineering, and math. Right? We are a robust people with robust ideas, and they need space to germinate. And the idea, Article 4, I thought was particularly interesting too. Foster and support a form of education and access to the arts and the humanities designed to make people of all backgrounds and wherever located masters of their technology and not its unthinking servants. Right? So think about the Internet of Things that exists today. This was written in 1965. Right? Think about that. I mean, they are projecting forward that man is not made of machine alone, right? Think about that. Think about the history there. I thought that was important. I wanted to share that with you. That's us. That's our crew of New Hampshire Humanities. We look pretty cool. There's Trisha right there. There's Trisha right there. Right. That's what we do every day. For those who don't know, we've been operating in this state for 47 years, which is a long time, right? And we basically have 3 roles in the state. We're a convener. We convene around programs, which I'll get to in a minute. We convene around ideas, and we convene around resources. We're a funder. We have mini grants and major grants, and ideally we're moving more and more as the catalyst for positive systems change. This, Dennis, over here is a speaker in our Humanities to Go program, no less. Don't want to put you on the forefront, but I thought I could. Give you a sense of what we do in the state. Last year we delivered 760 programs. 749 of those were free, 11 of those were low cost. 282 in District 1, 478 in District 2. Now, we touched about 241,000 people in the state alone. And I think in particular with the use, if we look at technology and leveraging that can be pushed. We just launched our podcast series with NHPR and so on. We touched about 170 different communities. We partnered with 338 different non-governmental organizations. And we put about $72,000 out on the street in small mini grants to support community-based humanities work, making sure that the arts and the humanities are available to everybody. Again, no matter who you love, no matter how big your pocketbook size, no matter what language you speak, no matter which country you came from, it's a big tent. Everybody's welcome. So before I get there, I got ahead of myself. So you get me in my pulpit, it's over. I'm just kidding. But real quick, I mean, one of the things that we were brought here today, and I just want to give you a quick background on who we are and what we do. But today we've been asked to consider the historical role of arts and literature in interpretive spaces. Spaces where it can grow and develop, and discuss the value of presenting more inclusive stories and diverse representations in these public spaces, publics both in the physical form of public spaces, but also in the public space here of convening and people coming together. But what I thought I'd start with a bit of some history that I've been thinking about that I've shared with some of my colleagues here. And I want to talk the implications of how has humanities and arts been used in the past to help shape our beliefs. That's why we're here today. Right? So as I thought about growing up in the church, right, and to think about, for example, this image, and the role that this image has played in how we think about religion today, and thinking about how white Jesus has operated really stealthily as a thin veneer, it helped advance some white supremacist theory and thinking and political ideologies. I would argue to you that this really was the beginning concept of this false construct called race. Race is only skin deep, right? We all know that. And this began this idea, I would humbly suggest to you. And it also creates the opportunity for the other. Because in fact, if you're the other, it's easy to enslave a human being who's not me. Think about it. And this is the most difficult thing to think about. As the staff and I discussed this slide on Friday, it was the one that people had the most difficulty with. Because it touches you. It really forces you to think and reevaluate what this image means to us as a people, but us as individuals. The next space, what's beautiful? Think about this. I was talking to my mother about this morning. The idea that as a society we've concocted these false realities of what is beauty. And we've always trying to get there. This false construct. This is beautiful. We've seen everything from Venus de Milo and her hearty self, if you will, to Kate Moss. You know, hearty, you like that word? Just trying to come up with something, thoughtful there real quick. Mixed company, if you will. So, but also think of the growth of monuments. These monuments were constructed at the end of Reconstruction in early Jim Crow. These monuments were placed in the public space to remind people that the South can and will, in some of their beliefs, rise again. Think about these monuments and what they mean to everybody. Not just them, but also to others. And so I think that's important for us to think about. Again, think about the conversations today. And then in public textbooks, I think the history, and Tricia was really helpful to me in this particular, thinking about the use of textbooks and how they're used. This textbook, to the far left, Mexican American Heritage, was in Texas. It was a wonderful case. And you'll see in my PowerPoint presentation, I give you the URL so you can look at this case where the histories that were told were so slated and slighted that, not only did it, Tricia, how would you frame this? Where are you at? How would you frame that discussion there? In a nice way.
In a nice way?
Yeah.
Politics and people's personal biases can sometimes influence what appears in textbooks, particularly depending on the politics in that particular state. So in Texas, they published a pretty racist textbook about Mexican American history.
Right. And these are in textbooks. So again, this has been going on since day one. And so, think about these are, this book, The Lies My Teacher Told Me, and not purposefully, I'm sure. So, I just want to give you a certain examples to think about in the public space, how art, how monuments, how textbooks, and how these things can really affect, again, what we believe and how we believe, right? Now, I was also raised as a kid who grew up in Ohio, that sometimes just complaining is just bitching. And just, if you didn't complain, you always got to think about other ways to think about things. And so, I wanted to think about other ways to think about this, and I want to illustrate through example. So, how can we support inclusivity, representation in the public space? Well, it starts with being intentional about what we do every single day, right? And so I wanted to pull out our latest value statement, by the way. Oh, and I got to say, in full transparency, Dennis Britton is also a member of our board of directors at New Hampshire Humanities as well. But I particularly wanted to pull out that part that's bolded there, So, and in collaboration with a diverse group of people, especially the voices of people whose stories have not been fully or accurately represented throughout history. This is a part of our value statement. This is what we wake up, we live and breathe every single day, right? These are actually virtues. I've used virtues being a bit more aspirational. So we're just finishing our strategic plan up now. And so to give you a sense of some of our goals, they are, for example, engage in increasingly diverse constituency and high-quality humanities experiences that enrich personal and public life and foster civic engagement and discourse. Become a much more diverse and high-performing organization. These kinds of things, you have to be explicit about what you want, or you'll never get anywhere. This is where my experience around community development is particularly interesting. And think about the importance of space. So I want to talk about inclusive design for a minute. Because if you think about it, form follows function, right? Think about it. And so I wanted to give you some ways to think about, as you're thinking about how you can develop inclusive spaces, think about it. We need to design for differing abilities. Sometimes we think about just the physical, but we don't think about the social and emotional, right? And those that are cognitively impaired at some level. Consider the gender dynamics. Provide amenities for cultural activities. Recognize public spaces as the ability to tell stories. We live our life through telling stories. Telling stories. That's what we do. And spaces can help us do that. Is that fair, Michelle? Gotcha. And it's also, we need to make a little room for retail, too. So, by the way, when I was just in the Black Heritage Trail in their offices, I bought a new bow tie. I'm going to buy another one, too. That's why you do it, because it creates community. But also, you need to think about programming for inclusion, right? The best public spaces inspire inspiration. They inspire us to think and create differently. That's why I like number 5. Let people surprise you, right? Because we can do that. So again, reflect the culture of the community. We want to always support vending. We want to encourage eating and cooking together, because that's what we do as people. No matter where you're at, we got to eat. You got to eat. Right? Again, I point you to some additional resources there. But I want to talk about this too, and this is particularly important for those of us in the community development space who think about this every single day, which is the implication of federal and state policy. So if you look here, and I'm going to make sure I get their name correct, here in the UK, I thought this was so particularly interesting. my little notes here. The Art Council of New England, of England rather. They are the NEH, as described, the National Endowment for the Humanities Equivalent. So this year, they said that if a certain number of, basically they said that the arts community was not meeting their mandates in terms of diversity and inclusion. And they said if you want to receive public funds to in fact serve the public good, then you have to ensure that a certain number of programs, board members, staff represent the diverse communities, and they actually tied those basically to their population, which I thought was particularly interesting. And so you can use policy to support diversity and equity in different ways. And I thought that was a particularly interesting example of where you can do that. And the community development space is called a backbone organization, and that's what they do. So I just want to give you some examples of ways to think about how you could approach this topic instead of just talking about the history of it. And that's it for me for now. So I'm going to be quiet and take my leave and allow my other folks to get up here and do their thing. So thank you very much for allowing me to share.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
I'm very happy to be joining you for this conversation and to have the opportunity to take part in, I think, a really important public dialogue that you're all embarked upon here. I am going to try to use a very specific case study in order to probe a little bit more deeply at one of the themes that Anthony opened up for us, which is the way in which monuments, historic sites, and public spaces help to constitute our understanding of the world that we live in and serve as a foundation for some of the beliefs that we carry with us in the world. My organization is called Revolutionary Spaces, and as you heard in the introduction, it is a brand new organization. Actually, it only came into being on January 1st of this year. It's formed through the merger of two very old public history organizations in Boston, two of the oldest preservation organizations anywhere in the country, the Bostonian Society, which was founded in 1881 to care for the old State House, which you see on the left there in Boston, which was the seat of government in Massachusetts at the time of the Revolution and was built in 1713. And then the Old South Association in Boston, which was actually founded a few years before the Bostonian Society in the 1870s in order to prevent Old South Meeting House, which you see on the right, from being torn down and having that location redeveloped. So both of those organizations were founded at a very specific moment in time, and I'm grateful for their efforts to preserve these two structures because they are incredibly important touchstones for our nation in defining who we are. And it's so important that they're still here, they're still on the Freedom Trail. Hundreds of thousands of visitors from around the world visit them each day. They're just 2 blocks away from each other. So one of the exciting things about our organization is that we now have an opportunity to tell the story of the two sites in an integrated way. And they relate very deeply to each other. And I've put this marker in the middle here. That is the Boston Massacre marker, which is just outside the old State House. The Boston Massacre took place in the space just under that balcony there. And that's just really a notional gesture toward the opportunity to program the street, the 2 urban blocks between Old South Meeting House and the Old State House in some meaningful way moving forward. And I want to tell you a little bit about some of the thinking that we're engaged in about what our programming should look like. But what I want to do is to start by reflecting on these buildings as monuments in a way. So we have had, I think, an important national conversation about all those Confederate memorials, right? Those efforts that were made in the second half of the 19th century in many of our communities to remember those who had lost the Civil War, and yes, in some ways to honor their sacrifice and move forward as a new nation. But we make a mistake if we think of those monuments as just representations of the past, right? What they do in our public spaces is to reconstitute our reality. You cannot have a statue of the leaders of the Confederacy without it standing in some way for the ideals that those folks stood for and for the idea of white supremacy. So I think we've had an opportunity to grapple with that. We have not resolved the issue, but at least we're talking about it as a nation. As we shift our gaze to the space in which I work every day, the Freedom Trail in Boston, I think it's really important for us to remember that it doesn't have to be a statue to have been an intentional and selective choice about what should be preserved and what stories should be told. So what I want to encourage you to think about is why the Bostonian Society and the Old South Association stepped forward to ensure that these buildings were preserved in the 19th century and not slave dwellings, not the workshop where shoemakers had done their work during the 18th century, right? These buildings had particular meaning to the very Brahmin founders of these two organizations. And during that moment in the 1870s and the 1880s, there were a few very important things going on. These folks felt the ground shifting under their feet, right? So, for one thing, the first great wave of immigration into Boston, which had happened during the 1830s and the 1840s as Irish immigrants entered into Boston, their children were now beginning to move into city politics and were directly threatening the long-standing primacy of the old sort of blue blood stock in Boston in ways that were concerning, right? The other thing that was happening was that our nation was experiencing a massive second wave of immigration, and there was a lot of hand-wringing, not just in Boston, but all over the country, about whether American values would be lost, whether the sort of unwashed masses from Eastern and Southern Europe would be able to integrate fully and would mind their place in a properly organized society. So I don't want to over-interpret what was done here, but I think we need to remember that at least one of the motives behind the preservation of these sites was a kind of reassertion of Brahmin privilege. And we need to say that for what it was, right? So our families were here at the time these buildings were built, in case you didn't notice. We were in charge, right? So there was a real Boston, and we happened to stand for real Boston. And so maybe all of you should stand by the margins here, stand over at the side of the road, and let us continue to do our thing, because we're 100% confident that we know how to do this right, and we're not sure that you do. Right. So that was a long time ago, and in no way does our organization stand for that any longer. But I want to encourage you to think about the possibility that buildings could passively have been reproducing that sense of privilege across time. And I wasn't able to get the AV to work, but I actually had pulled, for the next slide here, a clip from a Patriots game from a few years ago. It was a national broadcast. I think the Patriots were in the playoffs. And I wanted to point out that nationwide, these two buildings are often seen as the most iconic Boston structures. And so when CBS needed an establishing shot to show people that, well, this game is taking place in Boston, they often show a clip of the old State House, right? To me, it's concerning, because these buildings don't connect deeply to everyone in Boston. We are an increasingly diverse city, as we are an increasingly diverse nation. And when people say the old State House and Old South Meeting House are perhaps the most iconic structures in Boston, and you don't feel like they're yours, what does that imply about what your place in the city is, right? So these are buildings that have been passively, I think, acting as tools for exclusion, for articulating where people fit into the society that we share. And so the challenge that our organization has set for itself is to figure out how to turn that upside down. How can we turn these buildings into vehicles for radical inclusion? And I won't say that we have it figured out, but I think the answer is made of a few things. One is to think, we have thought deeply about what is the core story that we should be telling at these sites. And that is a story about the origins of an unfinished set of arguments that we still have every day as Americans, right? So think of those two buildings as two of the most important places of origin for our deepest questions about how we get to have a voice, right? So the old State House was the seat of formal politics at the time of the Revolution. Old South Meeting House was the largest indoor gathering place in Boston, and so it was often the place where popular politics happened. When the town wanted to meet, they couldn't fit into little tiny, at that time, Faneuil Hall, they spilled over into Old South Meeting House. We often think of it as, it's most famous because it's where the Tea Party meeting began in 1773. Together, the tension between popular politics, people advocating to be heard, and elected or appointed officials in the halls of government, that tension is really what the moment of our origin as a nation was all about. And there's a set of questions that live there, right? Who speaks for me? How do I get to have a voice? What's my recourse if I'm not being heard? And then this question that we're still arguing about in every neighborhood in this country, which is, we have documents that say we the people, but what exactly do we mean when we say we, right? That feels really alive right now, and I think these buildings, where we have landed as an organization, these buildings are not a place to bring people together to learn about the past. They're a place to bring people together to continue the work of grappling with those questions and finding answers that empower us to build the world we want to live in tomorrow. How can we equip people through an encounter with these buildings where those questions flow from to have a richer, more meaningful, and more inclusive conversation about what we the people should mean today and tomorrow? How can we make a more just and more equitable society? So I'm just going to take a quick spin because I know I'm probably speaking too long here, but just what does some of this work look like in action? One thing that we've done is try to blow up the easy stories that we have told and find the other stories that are embedded and sitting right next to them, and to use those as a starting point for conversation. So what you're looking at here is a play that we mounted in Representatives Hall in Old South Meeting House, in the Old State House in 2018. And that door that you see in the middle here is an item from our collection. It is the original front door to John Hancock's house, which is now gone. And we were very excited to be able to put it on display. We partnered with a preservation carpentry program to reconstruct the entire portico of the now no longer extant Hancock House, and wanted to allow people to feel like, here I am standing in front of this important place that we know because it's associated with a famous, wealthy white man, an important figure in our founding conversation. But we also wanted to insist that that door did not just define John Hancock's life. It was also a marker for the lives of everybody else who lived in that household. And so we commissioned a playwright to write a play about two of those figures, Dolly Hancock, John Hancock's wife, and Cato, who was born into slavery in the Hancock household and managed to secure his freedom in around the age of 30 and made a difficult decision about whether to stay or to depart the Hancock household at that time. But here was an opportunity to show that something that we've preserved because we think it is associated with one story actually can tell many, many other stories, right? And this play, we ran every day, 3 times a day that summer, and then brought it back this past summer and used it as an opportunity to have a conversation about, A, did you know that 10% of Boston's population was enslaved at the time of the Revolution? What does that mean? How does that force us to think differently about the founding era? And B, what does that mean for today? How can we turn that into substance for a conversation about how race sits relative to our conversation about we the people today? That was really successful, and we went one step further last summer and mounted a play that dramatized an anti-slavery petition, one of a series of petitions that were brought by people of color in Boston during the years before independence, and were heard in this chamber that you see here, which is the council chamber where the royal governor met with the provincial council. This petition contains natural rights language that anticipates the words that will be in the Declaration of Independence written 2 years later. And its authors are not known by most of our visitors, right? So Prince Hall and other people of color in Boston who were incredible advocates for, we want to take seriously the idea that we should be advocating for the defense of our liberties, so can we think about what that means relative to the institution of slavery? And a very conscious decision was made not to pursue the conversation about slavery for fear of fracturing the coalition that was united around the defense of the liberties of the assemblies of the colonies relative to Britain. So we had a whole arc of conversation, about 4,000 people in the building at different points during this past summer, talking about that issue and relating it back to the present. I'm just going to take a quick buzz and then sit down because I'm stealing time from the Dennises here. But I want to look forward to, this year is the 250th anniversary year of the Boston Massacre, and it's an opportunity for us to recognize that what we're proposing to do at Revolutionary Spaces, to use the past to sustain a conversation about racial and social justice today, and what those can look like in our shared future, that we are not new in doing this. There's a long tradition of doing this, and the massacre is a fantastic opportunity for us to remind people of that, and as we approach in 2026 the 250th anniversary of American independence, to begin a conversation about how we want to remember the founding for our own time, right? What does that story mean to us today? And I'm not going to tell you about the Boston Massacre, so you can ask me afterwards if you want, but this image, I think, is important because of what's missing from this image, which is the figure of Crispus Attucks, who is a man of mixed African and Native American descent, who was one of the 5 people killed that night. It's not until the 1840s and the 1850s that he's put at the center of our memory of that horrible episode that happened in March of 1770. And this is a lithograph that appeared in the 1850s that places Attucks right at the center of the story, and we need to understand that black abolitionists are pointing to Attucks as a response to slaveholders and their allies who at that moment, as we approached the sectional crisis that would give us the Civil War and ultimately the destruction of slavery, slaveholders were arguing, well, you can't do anything about slavery because what would you do with the former slaves? Because everybody knows that you can't make citizens of black people because black people can't sacrifice on behalf of the common good, and that's the hallmark of citizenship. And if they can't be citizens, where do they fit in a democratic society, right? So black abolitionists in Boston in particular are pointing to him and saying, gee, you may not have met our friend Crispus Attucks, right? He was the first from one point of view to sacrifice on behalf of this experiment that we call the United States, and we should remember that. There's a long tradition in Boston of honoring the figure of Crispus Attucks, but also of using the anniversary of the Boston Massacre each March 5th to sustain a conversation about civil rights and social and racial justice. So this is a photograph of Melnia Cass and members of the Boston Equal Rights League in the 1970s. The Boston Equal Rights League was founded early in the 20th century by William Monroe Trotter, and he really elevated Crispus Attucks Day to a touchstone in Boston in its conversation about race in the city. And so I think, we want to approach this year's anniversary of the Boston Massacre in that same tradition. Let's use the history to get people having a conversation about where the lines of division are in our society today and how can we build a more just society, a more inclusive society. So all of the activities that we have planned, an exhibition, a public art installation, 2 plays, are really operating in that principle. Bring people together to experience a bit of the past, but as a platform for conversation about where we want to go tomorrow. And our hope is that in all of the programming and throughout the semi-quincentennial of the country that will not culminate until 2026, we will find a way to center our commemorations on these important questions. What do we mean when we say we the people? To whom does our founding story belong? Does it belong to some, or does it belong to all of us? And how can we use these moments to promote a more inclusive practice of democracy in our communities? So those are the problems that we're working on. And I can't say we found all the right answers, but I think it's really vital to work at turning these touchstones for our sense of who we are as a nation into tools that promote an inclusive practice of democracy today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dennis Britton. I teach English at the University of New Hampshire, and particularly I teach Shakespeare. I was hired as a Shakespearean. And I think my presentation will nicely follow Anthony and Nat's presentation. I think you're going to find some overlapping themes and ideas. How many of you were forced to read Shakespeare at some point in your life? Almost everyone. How many of you enjoyed Shakespeare? I will turn my hand. All right, okay, some of you, but maybe not all of you. I was forced to read Shakespeare in high school, and actually I hated it. It was so boring, seemed so irrelevant to my life at 15, 16, 17, 18. But when I got to college, I was like, oh, okay, this is what the big deal is. That being said, I think part of my interest, so one of my areas of research is the intersections of race, theology, and Shakespeare. And I think partly that my research interest came from the fact that the deeper I got into the study of Shakespeare, the more aware I became that the people who study Shakespeare as a profession did not look like me, as well as the fact that if you sort of say, what does a Shakespeare professor look like? I am probably not the image that first enters your head, nor my students' head as well. So I love Shakespeare, but I'm also very aware of the ways in which Shakespeare has been used for nefarious purposes. And who is excluded from the study of Shakespeare, and how Shakespeare has used to exclude other people. So these are some questions that I think about, and I think some of these things have already been touched upon. And I'm using Shakespeare as also a sort of case to think about the topic of this panel today. Who has determined what counts as great art? I'm a literature professor, so I'll use art very broadly. Literature I consider to be art as well. Who are the great artists? Who are the great artists who have shaped Western culture and I'll put that in quotation marks, that's also a very problematic idea. Oops, there's a typo there. Who are the artists that any educated person should know, and who should be publicly celebrated? And this is a really interesting conversation that I feel like is going on in higher education as where I belong, where I work. But I think higher education has to think about these questions because it's often from higher education that ideas begin to disseminate through the ways in which we teach future teachers. Everybody who wants to become an English teacher in the state of New Hampshire has to take a Shakespeare class. That's good for my employment, so I'm not that unhappy about that, but it also means that I'm also sort of aware of what it means that it's a mandatory class and that there are ideas about Shakespeare that are going to be passed down to future generations. But this is part of a larger conversation. Folks might have heard about this on the news just this year. This has caused quite a bit of uproar, that the art history department at Yale has decided to cut its survey of art history from the Renaissance to the present, partly because it was too white, too straight, European, and male. And you can imagine that has caused quite a bit of controversy, but part of the desire, or part of the reason for cutting this class was to make the study of art more inclusive. One can imagine if you start with the Renaissance, you're beginning with Michelangelo and Donatello and Raphael. And yes, important, influential, beautiful art. We even had a picture of the David up there earlier. But you can imagine if you start a class, you only have 14 weeks in a semester. If you begin with the Renaissance and get all the way to the present, how much time do you think you're going to be dealing with artists of color, women artists, non-straight artists, right? You can see how the very construct of this class is teaching students what is important by the very duration of time that is spent on particular subjects. This also, Shakespeare has not been free from this controversy. This in 2016 at the University of Pennsylvania in the English department. There used to be a portrait of Shakespeare there. Students took down the portrait of Shakespeare and replaced it with a picture of Audre Lorde, the black queer woman poet and essayist. And you can see this is someone tweeting about this, and his tweet is very interesting. One could sort of just analyze the language of his tweet. Shakespeare just got deported and replaced by Audre Lorde. Deported in our, we won't go there. That's an interesting word. But I think you can see that Shakespeare and what we are sort of value is really becoming a question. And I'm saying this again as someone who loves Shakespeare. I also love Audre Lorde. And I'm like, take down the picture of Shakespeare. More students need to read Audre Lorde. They'll get Shakespeare. If or not, that's okay too. But Shakespeare also has a real public presence in the United States, not just in England. So these are statues in the United States. If you go to England, there's a statue of Shakespeare just about everywhere. But even across the US, there are these statues of Shakespeare. This one's in Central Park, the one on the left. This one's in Chicago. I found some in San Diego. I found some in Oklahoma. They're everywhere. There's even a bust of Shakespeare. I thought I had a picture of it, but there's even a bust of Shakespeare randomly on the side of a building on Beach Street in downtown Boston. It's like, he just seems to pop up in our public spaces. And I think that has something to do with the way in which we as Americans, right, have been taught to venerate Shakespeare and to see him as being the greatest author who has ever lived. And then if he is the greatest author who has ever lived, what does that mean about all the other authors who have written? But apart from these monuments to Shakespeare, there's actually an entire library devoted to the study of Shakespeare in Washington, D.C. So this is a privately funded library, but this library sits on Capitol Hill. It sits right across the street from the state capitol, and it's built in, white marble, just like all the other federal buildings. It's to sort of give it that grandness, right? And again, I've been to this building, I've studied there, I've worked there. It's a great place to sort of do one's work. But the founding of this building has an interesting history. So in 1932, the very first president of the Folger Shakespeare Library gave an address to the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, as well as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, as well as all the other dignitaries who were there. And he said that this building was standing as a monument against the forces of immigration, which was a menace to the preservation of the long-established English nation. So, I mean, there's a lot going on there, right? Not so somehow, this is in America, but this is an English nation. So, there's this interesting sort of mixing up of language and nationality. But I also a sense that somehow we as Americans have just rightfully inherited, and we are the ones, right, who are going to sort of maintain Shakespeare's greatness. This is the largest repository of Shakespeare books, documents, artifacts in the world. Right, so this is in Washington, D.C. But again, Shakespeare being used not for enjoyment, not because, okay, he's influential, he tells a good story, I agree, but particularly being weaponized, right? And seeing as a way of fighting off anxieties about cultural change and inclusion. So, one of the things that I do when I teach Shakespeare is I usually don't begin with Shakespeare. I actually usually begin my Shakespeare classes with writers of color talking about Shakespeare. Because I think one of the things, which is something I had no idea about when I was in high school. I think maybe had I known that black writers wrote about Shakespeare, read Shakespeare, taught Shakespeare, I might have come to an appreciation of him a little bit earlier. But also as a way of, many times these writers of color are critical, sometimes of Shakespeare himself, but they're often critical of the way in which Shakespeare has been used against them, right? To marginalize them, to say that they don't matter, right? If Shakespeare is what matters, how is any writer of color supposed to matter? And one of my favorites is by the African-American poet Nikki Giovanni. Now, many people don't necessarily think of Nikki Giovanni and Shakespeare in the same sentence. When you think about Nikki Giovanni, you probably think of the African-American poet who was an important figure in the Black arts movement. But in 1990, she wrote an essay that appeared in a Shakespeare journal, right? So an academic journal that was called Shakespeare and Giovanni. That essay was later published in a collection of essays called Racism 101. And this essay is the second essay in this volume. And one of the reasons I really like this volume is that it seems to be just Giovanni's just musings on everyday life, this or that. Never in this volume does she say, and that's racist, right? But we're supposed to be understanding just through her sort of meditations or reflections on various topics, how so much of what we've been taught, so much of what we value has been racially inflected. So it's not necessarily, so she doesn't say, and that's racist. She never says, and Shakespeare's racist. But the value in which we have placed on Shakespeare and other writers like him, all of that is based in a racist history. And of course, I love the title, Race. This is like our primer, right? This is like our introductory class to racism, and Shakespeare plays a part in that. Oops, I think I'm missing a slide. Oh well. So I just want to read you a little bit of what Nikki Giovanni has to say about Shakespeare. Shakespeare is lucky. There is an old African saying, "You are not dead until you are forgotten." Many groups share that. So do some American Indians. The Euro-American must believe it because he works so hard to keep his history alive. It's fine by me. I hope, like Shakespeare, to one day be on Jeopardy. I hope high school seniors will quake at the fact that they have to take Giovanni before they graduate. I can certainly see the controversy over who actually wrote my poems. Why did I never receive a major poetry prize? These things get many a professor tenured, keeping many a family fed. One might even win promotion to full, with the lucky and unusual discovery of some obscure shopping list that proved once and for all that I had false teeth. These things matter. So Giovanni imagines a world where she is esteemed just as highly as Shakespeare. Right? If you haven't read Nico Giovanni, go read some. It's fantastic stuff. She's a beautiful writer. But she also knows that will never happen. Right? It is probably in my lifetime. Maybe, I don't want to say never, but she sort of writes this whole piece very tongue-in-cheek, realizing that it's unlikely that she will ever be a Jeopardy category. I'll take Giovanni for 1,000. Like, it's probably not going to happen. Though it is, I mean, I have watched, I'm not a huge Jeopardy fan, but it seems like almost every time I watch it, or every other time I watch it, Shakespeare appears somewhere, either as a category or it's some list of questions, somewhere in the question list. But she also, I think, really draws our attention to the sort of real economics of all of this, right? That, I'm someone who gets paid off of teaching Shakespeare. Again, I love him. But textbooks, right? She is not being read in schools, which means students are not having to purchase those books in which her poetry is appearing. There are ways in which the whole apparatus teaches us what's important. I mean, I love the line, "These things matter," right? And that word "matter" is a really important one. For Giovanni is pointing out that for whatever reason, our culture has decided that the study of Shakespeare matters, but the study of Giovanni doesn't matter. It's something we might do on the side. It's something someone might do as an elective. It's something someone might do during Black History Month. But for the other months of the year and for the other courses, we're back to studying Shakespeare or Milton or Marvell or Thoreau. All those people. I'm not anti any of those people, but I do think we need to be thinking more critically about what we consider to be important, what we value. And I think back to this question of what we consider to be great art. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, wow. Thanks for inviting me. I'd like to point out that I do New Hampshire Humanities lectures. I've done scores of them, I would say. And I'd like to point out that 2 of them were in buildings in which there were outhouses. That's how far abroad we reach. Actually, one of them had an outhouse that was in-house, which is a whole nother story I could do 10 minutes on. I'd like to also mention that I'm a Shakespeare major from UNH. And this is where it got me. I did study Shakespeare at Stratford-on-Avon. I studied at Oxford. I studied at the Bodleian Library, and then I moved on. So my problem today is my topic. The topic that I have for today is the worst topic I could ever have picked had I picked it, and I did. Blackface minstrelsy. You'll notice that I'm not using slides because it's gross, I mean, who wants to see that crap, And so I started to put together a slide presentation, then I thought, what am I doing? I'm showing this, I'm going to be an audience full of African American people showing them blackface images. No. So how did this start? It started when I mentioned to Jerry Ann that I had written a new book and I would like to plug it. So here it is. I'm plugging it. It's over there with a contribution to the New Hampshire Heritage Trail. And I said, hey, I could do blackface minstrelsy. And then I realized after I started putting the talk together that I like talking about black heroes. I like taking people that we don't know or didn't know that much. Last time I was here, it was Palm Spring, who's just this great character. Prince Whipple, Richard Potter, the magician that we didn't know that much about. Great, great stories. What I don't like is talking about white jackasses. And here I am. I look like all the people I hate in history. I mean, you can't find a horrible thing that ever happened in which the picture doesn't look a little bit like me. From serial killing to Hiroshima, it doesn't matter. Wiping out the Indians, enslaving people, they all look like me. So here I am talking about minstrel shows, which is white people dressing up like black people to make money and make fun of them at the same time. I spent about 3 years working on the book, and what happened was, in doing the research, Jana Morris, who you may know, who's the, I'll stay near the microphone. Jana Morris, who's the historian, the real historian of the music hall, has been there for 20 years, she's the production manager, had been putting together this database in which she's trying to have every act that ever was at the music hall from when it was built in 1878 into the present day, including the temple, which was on the same spot. Take that out of the video. The temple, it was on the same spot before that, all of which had minstrel shows. And what we found in looking at the research was a shocking number of minstrel shows. Minstrel shows were it. That's what everybody was coming to see for the most part. They were everywhere. There were over 30, 40 maybe different blackface minstrel groups that performed at the music hall. And we can see them in the records that are there. I mean, if you know enough about theater to know that if something works, you keep doing it, right? Because you're filling seats and you're getting paid. And so anyway, I started doing research. I read 2 really depressing, excellent books on blackface minstrelsy, which is just so depressing. And part of the research is that we know that it kind of got rolling in the 1930s. This white guy named John Rice performed a Jim Crow character. And in many ways, it was an homage. I mean, it's hard to think of, but blackface did not exist because it was boring, okay? It existed because it was more entertaining than what white audiences were seeing by white people. Let's face it, I dream of Jeannie with the light brown hair or whatever. So it starts out as this kind of racist yet fascination with African-American characters. So he takes this Jim Crow character and he develops it, and it becomes a big hit. The guy becomes wealthy. And I was happy, to see at the end of Wikipedia that he died of alcoholism. This is the kind of thing we feel, this guilt that I feel for being me. And so what happened was that this caught on. And of course, as the Civil War came on and we had the whole process of people being freed, then minstrelsy gets darker, and I mean that in a metaphoric sense, and darker, because the number of minstrels increases. Now we have shows at the music hall that are advertising 100 minstrels. All right, so 100 white people in blackface. And it also says, and then there were the Uncle Tom shows, which start again as an abolitionist story, the abolitionist, the Uncle Tom story, which turned into these Tom plays, which become more and more and more minstrel shows. And one of them advertised that there were going to be 100 people on stage, and maybe some of those people were black, but they were also being forced to black up. Okay, so we know that even black characters were putting on black grease paint, which is just unbelievable. And with it would be 30 colored children romping around on the stage. Now, whether they were colored or colored, we don't know. Whether they were kids from Portsmouth, we don't know. Anyway, you can read all about it. You can look at all the studies. I think I'm going through notes. I can't see very well, so my notes are almost, I should just hold these up. It's pretty much a giveaway what I'm going to talk about. But there were also black groups that were minstrels, okay? And I wanted to get all this in the book, because what I was taught by Valerie Cunningham, basically starting in 1996, was you go diverse. You put in everything you can. So in the 13 books that I've written, I think 13 or 14, since that she and I had our talk in 1996, and today, I have constantly been putting in all these references to Black history. I think I got 14 or 15 references to Black history. And in this book, I'm talking about the history of performing arts in Portsmouth from 1630, basically right to the present day. And I was able to find Black history references in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, so that I'm inserting them where they belong, where they were missing, where they were taken out, basically in every book that I'm doing. But it's a depressing topic, because you're talking about something that evolved after the Civil War to become a mocking, humiliating process, and in which we're making African Americans the other, we're making them, and it's not even them, that's the scary part. It's us dressed up like them, making fun of them, which is just about as dark as you can get. unless I mention the president. In terms of awfulness and fakeness and wrongness and evilness and not understanding the spirit of what people are all about. And this becomes acceptable family fare. And this is where you get nauseous, because it's acceptable by everybody. Okay? I mean, everybody is accepting it. It's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, it's worked its way into vaudeville. Vaudeville works its way into silent film. Silent film works its way into talking film with, of course, the Mammy song, Al Jolson singing, right? I watched this all the time when I was a kid. I didn't get it. I mean, I just thought, why is that guy doing it like that? I didn't get the connection at all. And so I don't know how it infected me. Infected? Yeah, that's right. So anyway, let me see. So what I wanted to point out was, and even though I can't read this, I did make copies. So in 1996, I'm saying to Valerie, is Valerie here? I can't see. I'm saying to Valerie, you got to put this stuff online. This Black History Trail stuff you're talking about is just dynamite. This is the best history I have ever seen. This is so not boring. And I'm not a history major, so I can say that. I did take one history course at UNH. It was the history of the medieval popes. And I do remember one thing about it. One of them was a woman. And that's all I remember. I'm sorry. Okay, so last year, the Christian Science Monitor, right, if you saw the article on Valerie, I'm reading the Christian Science Monitor, and of course, Valerie, in the article, in the Christian Science Monitor, mentions me. And I quote, this is from the article, around 1996, local history writer J. Dennis Robinson asked Ms. Cunningham, sorry, I gotta see this, if he could publicize her work through a new thing called a website. She was suspicious. This is all true. I mean, it's in the Christian Science Monitor. It has to be true, right? Now we're quoting Valerie. I didn't know who this white guy was, she says with a laugh. And we have a history of white people taking our stuff and capitalizing on it. Black face minstrelsy, rock and roll. I respond in the Christian Science Monitor. Valerie provided me with a kind of X-ray vision in which I can't look at a building or read a book without wondering, what is the rest of the story? I'm always wondering, all the time, what would Valerie think? So, what she provided me was the flesh on the bones of the American history that I'd grown up with, which is a bunch of decrepit old white guys doing bad stuff, or good stuff, as the case may be. So, and I was noticing that I was, in this book itself, I just happened to remember that I was writing a section about a guy who starts out a chapter, and it mentions in the resources that I was reading that he had 11 children without mentioning his wife. He had 11 children. If that's not Ripley's Believe It or Not. And so, the Valerie thing in which Valerie says, I don't really trust you. I don't know what the hell you're doing. What are you doing with my stuff? And I'm saying, I'm putting it on the web. And she's saying, what's the web? And we're going back and forth. And she let me, and I did. And you can read about that in the Christian Science Monitor. Nobody described blackface minstrelsy better than Frederick Douglass, who spoke here a couple of times, including at the temple just before it burned down and the music hall was built. This is Frederick Douglass describing people who perform blackface minstrelsy. They are the filthy scum of white society who have stolen from us, I love this, a complexion denied to them by nature. Okay, to make money and pander to the corrupt taste of their white fellow citizens. Okay, so how do I feel about this? Because I'm making money, sort of, not much, writing Black history, right? Among other things. I mean, the next book that I'm working on, I'm so proud to say that I'm opening the first chapter of the history of Great Island, which is Newcastle, with the story of the first New Hampshire woman. It opens with a woman. Nobody's ever talked about Amy Thompson. And so I opened the book that way. But keep this in mind, okay? First of all, what I wanted to talk about was how every white person has a Black history. And that was going to be the topic of my talk until it ran 10 minutes too long. So I cut all that out. Although I will mention the fact that I grew up, the first Black person I ever met, I was in high school. We had one. There were 1,200 kids in the school and one guy and one woman. But I grew up with Black history, and I wanted to talk about that, but I won't. I will mention only one incident in which I once asked my grandmother why I couldn't have more chocolate milk. And my grandmother explained to me that chocolate milk came from Negro cows. I am not kidding you. And that there weren't very many of them. Which is why you can't have more chocolate milk. I'm not, this is how I grew up. So anyway, luckily I met Valerie. I would like to point out, so as I'm watching television and I'm growing up, who the white scum are that performed in blackface minstrelsy. And this is just a quick list of people that you and I have seen on television, perhaps, in the movies, in blackface. Orson Welles, Bing Crosby, Fred Astaire, Shirley Temple, the Marx Brothers, Judy Garland, Doris Day, Laurel and Hardy, Desi Arnaz, the Three Stooges, Robert Downey Jr., Mickey Rooney, Johnny Carson, Jack Benny, Billy Crystal, Dan Aykroyd, and of course, Bugs Bunny. I mean, think about this. So I'm not going to tell you a lot about this horrible thing called blackface minstrelsy, but if you want to read about it and you buy the Portsmouth Herald tomorrow, or just go online for free, I've written a whole article about it, which will be on the front page of tomorrow's paper. If you pick up the March issue of New Hampshire Magazine, I've written about it in there. If you buy my book, I've written about it there. Am I doing what Valerie says? Am I pandering? Am I selling it? Or am I getting it out there, putting it where it belongs, and telling the story correctly? Thanks.
So today I introduced myself to Nathaniel and welcomed him and said, just, to mention the fact that the bar has been set pretty high by the previous two tea talks, and hopefully things would go great today. Well, what do you think? This was a fabulous, fabulous conversation. That was great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So just as a reminder, this is our conversation guidelines, and it's time for your questions, if you have any. Does anybody have questions? Sure.
I want to say, yeah, okay. Dennis, did you answer all the questions on Jeopardy?
I usually can, so in the Shakespeare category.
Also, I just want to say is when you said about Shakespeare, in my day, because I'm much older, it wasn't mandatory, but I'm a Shakespeare lover. I love it. And as far as African American history, in my day, it was not taught. I had to wait to go to college. And then I got a white man that taught me Black history.
Well, I do think it's an interesting question. Yeah, who does Shakespeare belong to? Right. I think you just assume that he's for if he's for high school kids, he's for upper middle class white kids and above, right? He's not for urban kids or black kids. I have a colleague who's teaching. He teaches at the University of Texas, San Antonio, El Paso, so right on the border. Most of his students are Yeah, Hispanic, right? Latino. So he's really cognizant of like what does it mean to teach Shakespeare to that population, right? So they do a lot of really great stuff. He teaches them there actually are Mexican productions of Shakespeare, and and they do a lot of sort of bilingual Shakespeare, which he encourages them to translate the plays into Spanish or move back and forth between Spanish. So I do think there can be good ways to engage Shakespeare, but there also can be very bad ways, right? And I think part of it is I feel like you just want to make sure that things are inclusive and accessible, right? And that you don't want to be saying that Shakespeare is for you but not for you, or you have to like him because that's what it means, right? If you don't like him, that's something wrong with you. Right? So.
Yes, my question's for Mr. Shadley. I happen to be a minister, and I've worked always in these old meeting houses, and I used to take groups of kids at confirmation time to Boston for a religious history tour, and we'd go to the Old South Meeting House and the Vilna Shul and the first black church in America, and a lot of other places, King's Chapel, and there used to be costume docents, and there also were some revolutionary soldiers and some British regulars, and Crispus Attucks would get himself shot in front of the old State House. And now they're all gone. And in their plaque are these truly boring, in their places, truly boring written plaques on stands inside these churches and outside. I suppose it was money, but it's just a terrible sacrifice of what made this all fascinating. Any way to bring it back?
Well, there's a thriving reenactor community, and there still is an annual reenactment of the Boston Massacre, and there is a Crispus Attucks in that reenactment. I have to say, I'm troubled every time it happens. It feels to me as though we shouldn't be reenacting the shooting of civilians at the hands of soldiers. We can only do it because of the luxury of the passage of so much time. But I will say, I've struck up a bit of a friendship with the young man who plays Crispus Attucks, and he started doing it when he was still a young teenager coming up through the Boston public schools. And there's a very active community of people who like to portray Revolutionary era military figures and civilians, and it is not a terribly diverse hobby, I think, for people to do that kind of living history in their free time. But Rashid, I think, really felt called to portray the figure of Crispus Attucks and he doesn't do anything history related in his professional life, but he's gone on and become very passionate about this piece of, he feels as though he's a keeper of this history for the community. And I had a conversation with him recently about he wants to play a role in trying to open up pathways for engagement in the exploration of this Revolutionary era history for folks in Boston's African American community. My sense is that there is a fair amount of suspicion about the way in which history has been portrayed on the Freedom Trail, and I think we bump up against some of what you were talking about, that it's been commercialized, and certain kinds of stories are commercialized for, and they get the crux of the story wrong, they're sanitized, they're overly cleaned up, and I think one of the things that we're trying to do in our work is to get out of the business of telling or portraying and leaving it there, and get into the business of bringing people together to participate in the making of meaning around the past. So one of the reasons I've been talking with Rashid and with many, many others as we pursue the 250th anniversary work this year is that we have wanted to have a rich set of dialogues with community members of all backgrounds as we approach the planning of the programming, so that we're asking questions that feel authentically relevant and that are not, coming out of the brains of our staff, but are truly part of an ongoing conversation with the communities that we're trying to serve about what matters. So yes, I think there's still space for the kind of playful bringing to life of the past, but my own plea would be for us to only do that kind of work if it's part of a dialogic back and forth with visitors that allows them to not just see, but to take that and to try to relate it to their own experience and think about it, what it means for the world that we live in today.
So I have a question while the microphone is going in that direction. It's for you, Dennis Robinson. Does your book include Sharon Jones's story of minstrel shows at Portsmouth High School that came to an end when she would not sing the closing act one year in early 1960s maybe?
Yeah, it was, the last minstrel show in Portsmouth, I mentioned them, but there's just a point at which you're also writing a book for someone. But the last minstrel shows that I could find in Portsmouth were in the 60s, that late. They seem to end right about the time of the Civil Rights Act. I don't know why that is, but they seem to fade out. But of course, by now, the professional minstrels were long gone. And so, and you can look on the Athenaeum website and you can see some of these images that I started to bring to you and then thought, what the heck am I doing? Right up into the 60s. But what we have is images of blackface vaudeville shows that are being done kind of nostalgically by local groups, and the local groups include the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, St. John's Church, the Kiwanis Club, and the Boy Scouts of America. These are who's dressing up in blackface at the last gasp, well, except, of course, the Prime Minister Trudeau. But these are the people that are dressing up in blackface as it's fading, but they're still watching it on TV. They're still seeing it every day. So this is what's so amazing is when people say, how could those horrible people recently do this when they were in college? Everybody was doing it. It wasn't that big a deal, and that was the shock. The shock isn't that it's a big deal, is that it's not a big deal. Now it is, great, that's great, but we have to remember that it wasn't for 200 years.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say, when they're talking about the Boston institutions that they highlight, that it wouldn't take that much extra to put on, which is a fun place on Joy Street, the African Meeting House. Wouldn't be that much extra to talk about Fort Hill that helped save us from the British. It's not just the massacre, it was a lot of different things. I think it is a stretch when you say if they have religious, pictures, that means ergo the other is bad. I don't buy that logic, to be honest with you, at all. I don't think it necessarily means that. But I think that they should, on every city, to make sure that these institutions are included. One of the best places I've seen is out in Fort Lauderdale. They have one of the largest Afro-American archives in the country, and it goes beyond Langdon Hughes and Jacob Lawrence, and they have a lot of different things that you learn, and the politicians come there. So the politicians should be going to all the institutions, not just, downtown, But I think just because somebody was privileged first or somebody was this, it doesn't mean ergo it was because of. I mean, if you see a white Jesus Christ, it doesn't mean somebody hates somebody else. I just don't buy that logic at all, with all due respect.
Somebody want to respond?
Well, you can go.
Well, I think there's two pieces there. As it relates to historic sites, yes, it's better to give people access to the full diversity of the historic sites that have survived, because there are many different stories that a range of different sites can serve as a touchstone for. That my organization has taken as a challenge. How can we take a site that is not generally thought of as a site that speaks specifically to African American history or many other histories?
Cultural things now.
So what we have said is every single American of any background should feel a deep and meaningful connection to these buildings, because it doesn't matter where your roots trace to. If you're part of the community that we share, you're part of a conversation about what we the people means. And it doesn't matter what side of that conversation you're on.
Excuse me,
thing-
so what's really important here is that this isn't a dialogue. We invite you to ask questions, and then once the answer is offered, you can ask another question, but it's not a dialogue. But thank you so much for your concerns, and I'd love to hear from Anthony too about the question of white Jesus. So were you finished, Nathan?
Well, all I wanted to say was I think there's a way to tell the story of these buildings that are the genesis of our ongoing unfinished conversation in a way which everybody can feel themselves to be in that story. They can see the connection, and if they become a place where the work continues, then it's not about, is it my history or your history? It's about, this is the thing that is the deep current that binds us all together, right? And it's in those buildings as a place of the origin for those conversations, but those conversations have spilled over the bounds and are everywhere. So,
Right, and what I can share with you, my experience, particularly growing up in the African American church, I've always thought as I've grown up, as I've gotten older, I'll be 50 in June, that the most segregated day of the week is on Sunday. And there's a long tradition of where they've separated this around this false construct called race. Again, it is only skin deep, right? I may have a bit more melanin than you, sir, but that's about it. That's their only distinction, right? But it is the most segregated day of the week, and it has been. And they've used religion as a means to separate us from, I would argue, since day one. And so I was asked of my opinion, and I wanted to share my opinion. And it's been I would never claim to be a historian, jack of all trades, master of none, if you will. But the reality of the situation is there's documented histories of how they've used this as a means to describe what has worth, or who has worth and who doesn't. I believe, in my personal heart of hearts, just my belief, my personal heart of hearts, is that this stuff gives license to treat those who may not look like you or share a common ancestry as you as something to be something different or other. I do believe it was a basis for that. And I do believe that it has served those that would prefer to maintain power above those who do not have it. So I do not, I appreciate your opinion. I don't take exception with it. We all have them, and I encourage you to hold on to yours. Mine is that it has been used for a long, long time. And I pray that it'll stop, but we'll see. I don't know if anybody would like to add anything to that. This is my personal.
Thank you for the question. This is the place to ask hard questions, and it's really important to feel safe in doing that. So we've heard different opinions and points of view, and everyone in this room has their own. So.
I grew up, I'm a little older than you, Anthony,
Yes, sir.
and my coming of age was full of the rebranding of the word black and the related transformation of aesthetics. So part of that was people began speaking about the fact that, is God white? That wasn't always something that was spoken out loud. Before these questions were asked, you could not see any black Jesuses or black gods in black churches. They were not there. And if they were there, then that was a radical church. And I think that it is supportive of what you were saying, Anthony, because when I began thinking of God as being black, or possibly black, but certainly not necessarily white, it did something to me. It strengthened me. It opened up all types of possibilities for me. And it connected me to my faith in a way that I had not been connected before. And I didn't even realize it. And it's not any mistake that around the same time or connected to this, women began saying, well, maybe God is a woman. And, that's so I just want to, I get it. I'm kind of, I didn't hear your presentation. I'm just listening to what you said so far that I've been here, but I think that's really, I agree with that. And I wanted to say one thing about minstrelsy and about who owns this history and whether you're taking advantage of it. Many of us know the song, the musician, local musician, T.J. Wheeler. Now, T.J. is, one could argue that T.J. is making a living off of black music, and T.J. would probably agree with that. And that's why it's okay, because T.J. is extremely respectful, and he honors and teaches about the roots of this music and makes no claim of ownership, only a claim of appreciation. So when you do this history, first of all, it's also your history. But because you are so careful and so thorough in it, and because you are so respectful, that removes any negative things that I might have. And sometimes I know that I felt that no white person has a right to teach anything about black people. I mean, that was part of the process for me. But I don't feel that way. This is also your history. Thank you for treating it with respect and for honoring the fullness of it and for being prophetic in your analysis of it. And I appreciate that.
Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. I read in a recent New Yorker magazine an article about the history of the reenactment of slavery, supposedly for instructional or educational purposes. I had never heard about that before, to admit that. But I wondered what you know about it, any of you on the panel, and what your thoughts are about it, whether for instructional purposes or whether in films, what your thoughts are about reenactment of slavery.
I mean, I can speak to it a little bit if you'd like. I think the idea of trying to capture the fullness, not just the things we might want to celebrate about history, but also the difficult dimensions of it, is probably the impulse that led to the idea that I think this especially was something that caused commotion at Colonial Williamsburg, the idea that at Williamsburg in particular, they made an effort to reenact slave auctions, which I think, you can understand where the impulse might have come from, but I think it's not the way. And I think they quickly realized it was not the way to handle such an incredibly freighted subject. I think we do need, as a nation, to grapple with the legacy of slavery. Until we have truly grappled with it and confronted it in our public life, we can't deal with its consequences that are still with us every day. But I think there are more sensitive ways of doing that. Two thoughts. There's a book by a philosopher. I'm now going to forget her name, Susan Hyman or Hyland, who spent much of her career living and teaching in Berlin. And she wrote recently a book that reflects on the very different ways in which Germans, in their public spaces, have confronted the legacy of the Holocaust compared with the way in which in the United States we have confronted the legacy of slavery through monuments, through our public spaces. We have simply moved on and pretended as though this is not something that happened, right? And all it does is pass the pain and the consequences forward to the next generation. We haven't had a real reckoning with it. In Germany, there's been a very urgent public conversation about the Holocaust that, I spent a year in the 1980s as a high school exchange student in Germany, and my social studies class, that was the year they talked about the Holocaust, and it was painful and hard, and you can see the way that this conversation is mapped on the public landscape through memorials and museums, and Susan's book is a reflection on what would that project look like in the United States. It's worth considering, but I will say that reenacting slave auctions is probably not the best way to do that. There is, I don't know if any of you have run across the slave dwelling project, but I think that's something that has real exciting potential. There's been an effort, there's a man who's pursued this as his mission and has managed to preserve many of the surviving slave dwellings on the landscape in a range of different states, and tries to bring people together to spend a night in one of those dwellings and to use that time together to have a really deep and meaningful conversation about the legacy of slavery and its impact on our lives as Americans today. Now that strikes me as a really constructive way to use that history as a platform for healing and for moving forward.
Excuse me, would you just say her name again, Susan?
I think it's Susan Heilman, or does anybody else know the book?
What's the name of her book?
I'm sorry. I'm really bad about remembering books in that way. But I will Google it afterwards. I'm sure I can. I've got enough that I could probably find it.
I could add one small thing to that. I was thinking out loud is that the reparations starts with repair, right? That's the root of it. It's repair. And my sense is the heightened sensitivities we have to subjects like this is largely because as a nation, we've not dealt with this issue. And we've not repaired ourselves. And we've not created spaces like this. Again, this is a complex, complicated, and very difficult conversation for even us to engage in. So again, thank you for engaging in it. But reparations begins with repair and acknowledging the past and owning it. And I think that goes back to your thing, Bob, which is, respect in an authentic way. Anyway.
Can I add just a note? The way it seems to me is a little bit like, I tend to think that the United States is approaching its adolescence. And yes, we have backslid to third grade in the last few years, but I don't think the way when you take a 13-year-old girl who's been beaten by her father and take her into therapy, will say, let's reenact the beating. You say, let's talk about it. And maybe you have an apology, maybe you bring him in for an apology, but I think this is just the beginning. To me, it took 400 years to start talking. And here we are.
I'm going to do a little quick time check. Okay, we still have a little bit of time.
2007, I guess it was, we took early retirement from Connecticut and went to South Carolina for 7 years to live on the coast. And we didn't know what we were in for. And one of the things we were very active in going to music performances and lectures, especially if they were free. And we found out one day we're sitting, and we went to one of the Christian churches, which were all white. And the next time we picked one, it was in the newspaper, it was all black, and we were the only two white people in the whole congregation. And we looked at each other and said, they still had great music, and I said, what is this all about? So we started to dig into it. So you're right, the churches are still segregated. The other thing is, I did adult learning courses. It's OLLI, we have OLLI up here, Oshawa Lifelong Learning Institute, in Beaufort County, South Carolina. And there was a speaker from Savannah who was doing research on the slave markets and the culture in Savannah during the slave era. And he was trying to get the city to enact plaques like the trail here to mark where these slave auctions were, because a lot of the buildings they were held in and so forth are still standing in the city of Savannah. I don't know if that ever took off the ground though. But he also told us very interesting cultural stories that those big homes from the Civil War era and they always had a carriage house out back. And it was a second story above, it was like an apartment. And that was for the black women concubines for the white landowner in front, in the big house with his wife and children. And everybody knew what was going on. They all had black concubines living behind their homes. And that's what they did. That was the culture. It's just unbelievable. And so the other thing is I also corresponded with the mayor in Charleston several times when I learned about the Black History Trail here and saying, what are you doing in Charleston? Oh, we're planning this big museum. I'm not sure if that museum has ever happened yet in Charleston, but we went to a private little museum there on African American history. And that was the only thing when we were there, this is like pre-2015, that even existed to acknowledge they had slavery in that city and so forth, and slave markets and so on. So I think in the South, there's a long way to go.
Nyman, I think they, right, thank you. Answer to the book question, Susan Nyman, apparently I get my N's and my H's mixed up. Susan Nyman, Learning from the Germans. Thank you. Thank you, Google.
So, my question is to the panel, and it's brought about by a question that was brought up. And it's really complex when we're talking about the public space and whose gaze are we preparing and whose story are we telling. Because I was thinking, I mean, you know, the shooting of Christopher Addicks. I wouldn't want to be there because I'd be imagining my son being shot by the police, right? So what story do we tell? And how do we tell it? And there's been a lot of talk lately about telling the story of enslavement at these houses, you know, that there was an article last year about visitors, white visitors we want to be entertained, so we don't want to hear the story of enslavement when we visit these plantation houses. But that then excludes us from visiting it because we want to hear the story, well, what did the enslaved do? You know, how did they create lives? How were they able to have children? And most of all, how did they move beyond that enslavement to live full lives? So I think creating these complex stories, it's really hard but it's a part of getting to the truth. I mean, at the Black Heritage Trail, we know what side we're telling the story from. So when people come, they know what they're going to get. We're telling it from a black perspective, right? But when we go into other spaces, how do we get a complete picture of what our history is, especially when we're in public spaces?
I can certainly take a stab at some response to that. First of all, the sort of tension around, well, I wanted a more celebratory or more entertaining story, right? So our current audience walking the Freedom Trail, coming into the buildings, does not, one way to put this is, it does not look like the city of Boston. It is a more white audience. It's a wealthier audience than our city as a whole. And we have had some experiences with challenges around this, but I will say some of it is the way that you put the history forward. So we have found if we put our forward-facing tour guides in the position of narrating the complexity, the full complexity of the history, we will sometimes get pushback and complaint. And when we push forward with doing that play, The Petition, that focused on the anti-slavery petition of 1774 and the debate in Boston around that, we spent a lot of time training our staff to deal with the possibility of angry customers. And we didn't have a single angry customer. And how do I explain that? I think it's because we put a work of art forward, and we asked people not to argue with it, but to respond to it. And there's a kind of power in that because we, across all the divides that we experience in our daily lives, share a common human experience, the common humanity in the humanities of how do we interpret a work of art. And we had people from very different political backgrounds, very different life experiences sitting together in a room saying, boy, what do we do with this? What do we make of this thing? How do we respond to it, and how do we relate it to our own experiences as human beings? It wasn't that those were easy conversations, any easier than a conversation like the one we're having here. They can be challenging, but I think people didn't resist entering the conversation. They had an invitation and they took it. However, I will say and this gets to the other part of your question, Jerry Ann, that somebody still has to curate the story. What is the story? Someone has to choose that. And we're also extremely cognizant as we begin as a little baby organization walking down this road, we're very cognizant that our staff does not yet look like the people of Boston. It is similarly a non-representative group, and our board, and so that is part of I think if we want to put stories forward that serve all, the process of curation has to be co-authored with the audiences that we're trying to serve. And that's why we've spent so long trying to engage in dialogue with folks who are interested in this work and have the answers and have the questions that we're trying to answer come out of those conversations. So, but I think there's no final answer to any of what you put forward, but I think the point is, and is implied by your question, that we need to be reflective about this. The practice has to be self-aware if we're going to move public conversation about these issues forward.
And Jerry Ann, I think that's particularly true when we think about New Hampshire, right? I mean, New Hampshire is changing demographically. I live in Manchester, y'all, just so you know. So I live in a community where 30% of the population are from communities of color. I live in it where my Manchester school district is a majority school district. So if you happen to look at some recent studies done by your colleagues at the Carsey School of Public Policy, where they cited, I think, 244,000 people moved into the state over the period of the past 5 years, 214,000 moved out. The net difference is 38,000. That's primarily majority of in terms of population growth in southern New Hampshire. I say that to suggest that a quarter of the population turned over in 5 years, right? And so when I think about our role as a statewide institution, you may look at that number of 760 programs we provided around the state, 740 of them all free of charge. But the question is, how do we continue to do this work and thinking about the nature and how the state is so different? We got 4 states in one, north of the Notch, south of the Notch, Seacoast, and Upper Valley. Think about it, and it's changing dramatically. So I'm asking ourselves as a board, to go back to your point, we've been around 47 years and a good track record. We've touched over 2 million people in the state. You remember that from your video, Dennis. But we're an organization who has to change. We have to change. And so we've adopted a theory that says it's not an either or, it's an and. So we have to respect the past and move forward into the future, but we have to do so in an intentional way. And that begins on the planning side. And so 2 notes that I wanted to just reinforce here, which is more inclusive public spaces start with a more equitable planning process to make sure all those voices are there at the very beginning of the project, and this is the other point that I want to leave you with, is that the nature of culturally relevant programming works best when not treated like a detached marketing exercise, right? And not a detached marketing exercise. We need to appeal to this segment. No, that segment is our segment, and that segment is us. So I just want to leave you with those 2 points.
Hello, I'm David Waters, a member of the board of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire, and I wanted to briefly summarize and thank our panel. Culture and race in the public sphere, and this is a public sphere today, right here, and I think we see how difficult sometimes, how important it is that we have different voices raise differences of opinion, and a lot of fruit for continuing conversation and perhaps argument as well. And Anthony reminded us that the founders said you thought you couldn't have a republic without a public and without a public sphere, and that's why there's always been a federal role, and that we just can't have a diverse and civil discourse based in the humanities is essential to civil visibility, but also to civil rights. And Jefferson said in a declaration that he placed facts before a candid world, and I think that Anthony placed some difficult facts before a candid world, that the history of the construction of race is found in the humanities and in the arts. And Nathaniel asked us, whose freedom? And he reminded us that in front of the old State House, Crispus Attucks spoke in blood. Of course, they've been shooting down Native people for, at that point, about 150 years in New England. And then Old South Church, where Phyllis Wheatley's owners worshipped, and she spoke in poetry about race. And I think the essential question that Nathaniel asks is, how is it that we deconstruct the historic preservation of white supremacy? How do we do that? And Dennis, Britton took on another monument, Shakespeare. What is great art? But also the question of the Englishness, meaning the whiteness of American culture and the arts. And I think the question he also was asking is, can public education itself in the United States be extricated from white supremacy? And Dennis Robinson, kudos once again for extraordinary research on blackface minstrelsy. And I do think that the difficulty here is that whether the blackface minstrelsy is practiced anymore, as Du Bois suggested, can the black face be seen in the American public without being seen in blackface? So as we conclude, what a value this has been today, and we have more to come. But I wouldn't be a good board member if I didn't take out the envelope. And there's our board president, Bob Thompson. But let me say where we're at. We have purchased this headquarters at 222 Court Street, and how important it is to make visible in a public space the presence of black history not just in Portsmouth anymore. It's not the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail anymore. It's the New Hampshire Black Heritage Trail. We are going statewide. We need your help. Now, maybe just use this for scrap paper to take your notes. And if you want to take it home with you and stick a check in here, great. But oh look, you could sit down today and you could take a credit card donation. Or, oh my goodness, look at this. You can put cash right in there. It works. We need your help. Thanks again to the panel, and thanks to you all for your conversation.